Hello everyone. In the previous video, we have seen the difference between the database management system and the file management system. In this video, we will discuss about the database architecture and what are the three database architectures. So database architecture, or you can say that structure of a database. It's a simple representation of the DBMS design. So database like DBMS architecture is a representation of a DBMS design. So what it will help? It will help in designing, developing and implementing the database. When we have the design of the database, then we can implement the database using that design. How many columns, what are the columns, different columns that we can include in the database. All these things we can define at this stage, database architecture. So database architecture allows us dividing the database system into different individual components that we can independently change, modify, replace, alter, and define. So the design depends on the architecture of the DBMS. And DBMS architecture depends on the users, that how the users are connected to the database to get their request done. So that is something a DBMS architecture. Now there are three DBMS architecture, that is one-tier DBMS architecture, two-tier and the three-tier. One-tier is the simplest one. So let's discuss all the three DBMS architecture one by one. So let's discuss first the one-tier architecture. One-tier architecture. So this is the simplest architecture among all the three. In this architecture, the user will directly contact with the database. There will be a user that will directly contact with the database. So any changes he will perform in the database will be permanent. It can change the data in the database permanently. So any changes done by the user will directly be done on the database. So this kind of architecture in which user is directly communicating with the database, directly accessing the database, is used for development of the local application, where programmers can directly access the database and then they will quickly changes the data in the database when they are building any application. So that is a one-tier architecture. So in one-tier architecture, database is directly available to the user. Now let's discuss about the two-tier architecture. So the two-tier architecture is somewhat similar to a client-server architecture. If you have seen the client-server architecture, so there will be an application that will run on the client side. Okay, so there will be a application. Here is a client. He is communicating with the application. Application can be a mobile application, a user interface, a web user interface, websites, anything it can be. And client is using that interface, that application, to communicate with the database that is present on the server side. Server. And in server, there is a database. So database is present at the server side and this is the client side. This is the client side and this is the server side. So client is accessing the database through the application. So here there is added security than the one-tier architecture because database is not directly exposed to the client. There is something in between them, that is the application, and that application will communicate with the database present in the server side and that will execute whatever the queries for the accessing and transaction management, whatever the data is present in the database after the query, they will fetch and then they will pass it to the client, and the data will be presented on the application or the user interface. So for this kind of interaction to communicate with the DBMS, client-side application first establishes a connection with the server side, and this can happen with the ODBC or JDBC like APIs. So that is the two-tier architecture. Now let's see the three-tier architecture. I will first write some points for the two-tier architecture. Similar to the client server architecture, application on client side communicates with the database that is present at the server side. For communication, application first establish a connection with the server. So this is a three-tier architecture. Here, if you compare with the two-tier architecture, we have only an application that is running on the client side. So that can be a UI through which the client will communicate with the database. So application is something that is directly communicating with the database. But here in the three-tier architecture, we have also put a new layer, that is application server. So application on the client side will not directly communicate with the database, but there is another layer in between the database and the application client, that is the application server. So this layer will prevent the application that is running on the client side to directly communicate with the database. So application on the client side will communicate with the application on the server side, and this application on the server side will communicate with the database directly. And the database, all the things, all the data will manage by the application server. Here in this architecture, end user will have no idea about the existence of the database, any information about the database beyond the application server. And here the database also do not have any information, do not have any idea about any other user beyond the application that is running on the client side. So this is a three-tier architecture. Nowadays, it is basically used in the large web applications. So here, if we talk about some important points, then this contains another layer between client and server. Client here will be the user and server will be the database. There is another layer, and the layer will be of the application on the server side and application on the client side. Client can't directly communicate with the database, or you can say that server. Here in this architecture, only the application server is responsible for everything happening in the database. So it is application server will only directly contact with the database, communicating with the database directly. These are some important points about the three-tier architecture. Now I hope all the three architectures you understood. So there are one tier architecture in which user is directly communicating with the database, means database is directly available to the user. In the two-tier architecture, we have created a single layer that is of the application present on the client side. Now it is like similar to the client server architecture. Here client will be the user, server will be the database. So here in the application present on the client side will directly communicate with the database. But the three-tier architecture, that is the best one. Here we have created another layer of the application on both the sides, on the client side also, on the server side also. So that will combinedly create a layer between the user and the database. And now client can't directly communicate with the database. There will be only the application server who is responsible for the communication with the database. And end user, the user does not have any idea about the database, and the database also has no idea about the users beyond the application layer. So that's all for this video. In the next video we will see the schema. What are the schemas for the database? Thank you.